from Moscow, Anissa Naouai in the Now today claims Russia is worse than ISIS, making fun of Nazi siege victims, and U.S. cops aim their guns and shoot to kill once again. We begin with Israeli troops and a UN peacekeeper, which have been killed as the IDF traded fire with Hezbollah fighters on the Lebanese border. The exchange began when an anti-tank missile hit an Israeli army vehicle in the Golan Heights, killing 2 soldiers. The IDF responded with a series of airstrikes that are believed to have killed a UN mission member. Its retaliation is set to continue. Israel's foreign minister says it will be forceful and disproportionate. The Israeli-Lebanese border has long been highly volatile. Tensions back in 2006 escalated into a full-scale war there and lasted 34 days. It killed up to 1,500 people, and around 1.5 million were displaced. Despite Israel's efforts to root out Hezbollah, the group only consolidated its hold on power. Well, all of that is adding to the highest ever level of demoralization within the Israeli Defense Forces. More on that later in the show. Greece is furious. No one asked for its consent when the EU published a joint, that's a key word there, anti-Russian statement. The document blatantly accused Russia of the deadly shelling in Ukraine's Mariupol, which killed 30 people, and threatened it with more sanctions. No need to mention that the country is not part of the conflict, and there's been no proper probe into the incident. Details. The thing is, Brussels was supposed to get consent from all 28 governments before publishing this. It failed to do so. Greece said it won't support the document. Plus, one diplomat told the EU Observer that 3 other countries tried to water it down but failed: Hungary, Austria, and Slovakia. Well, he added that nothing like this has ever happened before. But what has happened before are media attacks, and here's a new batch of those. Thomas L. Friedman of the New York Times has predicted Tsar Putin's next moves. Ukraine matters more than the war against ISIS, basically implying that Russia is worse than terrorists. Well, they certainly are more independent. Another piece in the New York Times, co-authored by a well-known Russia lover, George Soros. It basically says that despite Putin's attempts to squash Ukraine, it will rise up, the Russian people will see it, envy it, and want the same. Europe's reward will be a new Russia. Putin ordered Alexander Litvinenko's murder, cried The Guardian on its front page today. Then it quoted someone saying Putin is a common criminal dressed up as a head of state. All by the time you get to the second paragraph, which is what most only read. Not everyone will find out that this was the opinion of Litvinenko's wife's lawyer. A soft implication, right? Joining me in the Now is political scientist Brad Cabana. Brad, good to see you again. Russia is a bigger threat than ISIS. Not exactly Tom Friedman's words, but certainly an implication there. How insane is it going to get?
Well, I think it's going to escalate. You know, we're probably a hair's breadth away from war in the Middle East at the moment. You know, we have, of course, Ukraine, and that's escalating dramatically. So, I mean, you know, it's a matter of escalation. And I think that the vitriol is going to increase with that.
Right. These articles, I should point out, were published 24 hours within each other. Is this a notion among the American people? I want to believe that this is just the press trying to convince them, send a certain line. Do these publications, are they taken really seriously?
Well, you know, I think Russia has, for one reason or another, been, you know, respected, I would say, you know, certainly Canada. I mean, we have a long relationship with Russia. In the United States, you know, they've always had the vitriol there towards Russia, different economic society and so forth. But I think that I really don't believe that the people in North America, specifically Canada, have really any great remorse towards the Russian people. And I think most people see this as, it's international it's just politics.
What do you make of the EU basically accusing Russia of the massacre in Mariupol? 30 people, of course, dead. No investigation into it. Kiev accuses the anti-Kiev fighters. They accuse Kiev. The blame game continues. Is it fair for the EU to make such blunt accusations?
Oh, absolutely not. First of all, there was it seems that when things get escalated out of control in the Ukraine, something happens to pop up. Some time ago, it was an aircraft that came down. The investigation into that, MH17, is still not being made public. And so that's a concern. And now when things are starting to escalate again, now we have another incident of mass casualties. And also beyond that, I mean, let's face it, Donetsk, Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Lugansk, all those cities have been under extreme Ukraine shelling for at least 6 months, and massive casualties, far more casualties than happened in Mariupol. So, I mean, it's beyond hypocrisy to single out Mariupol as a war crime when war crimes have been committed throughout this entire adventure.
Right, and I think it's strong to point out that anyone can go and sort of research some of the footage, some of the evidence that is out there. I do agree that a lot of the results of these investigations, the fact that they haven't been made public, although promises are being made to do that, does hamper any kind of solution to this. I want to know what you make of the Greek government, the new Greek government, saying no, basically, to this document being put together by the EU Parliament. It didn't really make a difference. But are we going to see more independent governments, per se, in Europe start to push for more balance, for more investigation before accusations?
Well, Europe's been put in a tough place by the United States. They've basically been thrown into the middle of an economic war, if you will, between China, Russia versus the U.S. And so I would expect that as European countries would come to weigh their own self-interest, and for that matter, Mediterranean countries like Greece, that you'll start to see governments having to pick a side one way or the other. And I see in Greece, in the situation there, essentially that the Greek people are choosing to gravitate towards that Chino-Russian economic alliance.
All right, Brad Cabana with us in the Now, political scientist from Canada. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
71 years since the end of the Nazi siege of Leningrad. 872 days of tremendous suffering. More than 600,000 people died from starvation. Dead bodies littered the streets. 16,000 more were killed in Nazi bombings. Power supplies were stopped, no sewage systems operating, no heating, and temperatures were as low as minus 30 degrees Celsius. No water, no food, yet some think this is a matter to take lightly. A Russia weight loss social media group launched the Blockade Diet. It includes 400 grams of bread, water, and 100 grams of optional vodka. The idea is to relive Leningrad's heroic resistance against Nazi siege and draw energy from a collective effort. I was disgusted reading this, and I'm certainly not alone. We summed up the most inoffensive comments by deeply offended Russians after this. My grandmother died there. My mother weighed 18 kilos after the siege. She survived miraculously. So you suggest losing weight this way? Seriously? A moronic proposal. There are no other words, especially on this day. My God, how can the earth withhold these kinds of people? They lived, worked, fought, and died as heroes. What a sick, ugly time we live in. And I have nothing to add. Well, coming up, how U.S. cops trained to kill African Americans. Stay in the Now.
It was a terrible mistake. working very hard to take that forward.
And once again, we put something on the air. It's a flat-out lie.
Have you ever had sex with Governor Rick Perry?
No, wait. Do not answer that.
I want you to watch what we're about to do because you've never seen anything like this on television.
As the U.S. stripped Syrian rebels of financial aid, reports say groups previously favored by the CIA have had their money and supplies cut off or substantially reduced. But didn't Obama just say this last week?
We're also supporting a moderate opposition in Syria that can help us in this effort, and assisting people everywhere who stand up to the bankrupt ideology of violent extremism.
But now, even the favored secular militias groomed to fight ISIS have seen their funding cut in half, according to the Daily Beast website. They, of course, are using this to push their warmongering agenda. But what I'm interested in is this. The Obama administration has flushed out hundreds of millions of dollars in aid, either to train or equip so-called freedom fighters in Syria. The Syrian opposition, insurgents, or moderate rebels, call them what you want. Uncontrollable brigades of shifting loyalties and some ties to terrorists. So why the sudden change in heart and cash? Joining us in the Now is Danny Maki. He's a Mideast research analyst with us on the line from London. Danny, tell us, is there aid or not to the so-called Syrian rebels?
There is a large element of aid being sent to Syrian rebels and terrorists from the US government. This comes through weapons shipments, supplies, logistical support, communication support, and the majority of these weapons being sent are sanctioned or weapons given by the United States of America. These weapons range from telephones and mobile equipment to Tau rocket launchers and missiles. So the US has a very broad range of the type of aid they give to these so-called moderate rebels. But in essence, these groups are no more than a rabble of unorganized brigades who, when they're not fighting ISIS or the Syrian army, they're fighting each other. So the fact that these groups, which were deemed the linchpin of Obama's policy towards Syria and his strategy to fight ISIS, are in fact the biggest reason that Obama's policy in Syria and the region is fading. So in order for the US to have a different policy...
because the Daily Beast is using this to basically attack Obama. They would like to see full-out bombing of Syria, but that's another point. The point is, what I'm saying is that we're getting different messages here. If this leak is true and funding has stopped, what does this mean? Is this a signal?
What it is it's essentially a message to these armed groups that your performance on the ground, on the battlefield, has not been good enough. So it doesn't warrant an extra added impetus of weapons or shipments of aid from the United States. This is in essence due to the fact that moderate rebels probably control 1 or 2% of the whole of Syria today. They've been crushed by the Syrian army, they've been crushed by ISIS and the Al-Qaeda group, Al-Nusra Front. So this is a spent policy by the US. Obama initially wanted to train up to 5,000 of these rebels, which would stretch to 15,000. So far, even the Wall Street Journal has reported that hundreds of these rebels have already defected to ISIS, some of them have disappeared, and these rebel groups have been fighting in between themselves. I mean, I don't know how Obama could possibly describe a group such as Jaish al-Mujahideen as a moderate group, and the other rebel groups inside Syria which the US deals with, such as Al-Hazm group. They fight alongside Al-Nusra Front, which is an Al-Qaeda blacklisted group. So the allies of the US are essentially allies of Al-Qaeda. So the US is, in one sense, aiding the agenda of Al-Qaeda through its funding for these groups. And this funding is present because Al-Qaeda and ISIS have both taken very sophisticated anti-tank missiles, which were made in the US, sent by the US, and now in the hands of dangerous Al-Qaeda extremists.
I want to bring this more into the internal situation in Syria, if it's possible to bring it away from the United States, because representatives of the government and the opposition are holding several days of talks in Russia, here in Moscow. It's the first time the sides have met in almost a year. Do you expect any kind of breakthrough? Because a lot of people are quite pessimistic.
Well, I can comprehend why there's such pessimism. We have to essentially see what the point of this meeting is. And you need sides in Syria now which really have an influence on the ground. Even if we reached a political agreement as Syrians, it is very difficult to see whether the opposition could actually influence any of the militants on the ground. Because before any political solution comes, there has to be a ceasefire or a cessation of violence on the ground. Seeing as the opposition are not represented by any groups on the ground, they have no power. When they have no power, there's no need for the Syrian government to actually negotiate with them, because these groups only represent an external opposition which hasn't been in Syria for over 30 years. So in terms of the talks in Moscow, I probably state that it will be fruitless, but this does show that the Syrian state and other moderate opposition groups have a very open mindset in terms of political solution, and Russia is very hell-bent on aiding and facilitating a solution for the crisis in Syria. This is paramount.
All right, Danny Monkey, Middle East analyst and researcher with us in the now from London. Thanks so much. The number of Israeli army suicides has doubled. An increase in the number of IDF soldiers taking their own lives has parents reeling, but also defense forces in the spotlight. There's a 24-hour hotline meant to help. They get around 450 calls a day. RT's Paula Sleer met some parents whose boys never reached out for help.
You think about it and then think about it again, and then suddenly you find yourself on top of a high bridge, or you find yourself with a gun in your hand.
Yossi's son Dror chose his IDF weapon to end the pain. He turned it on himself just 1 month before his conscription ended.
The army says that the suicide is not connected to the fighting, to the battles, but definitely shaking a person will bring up things that he had hidden from before.
Dror was a medic assigned to a combat unit near Gaza. One night, under the cover of darkness, he suddenly started yelling and threw his weapon to the floor. His commander abandoned the mission, but left Dror with his gun. His father blames the IDF for his son's suicide.
If there was enough reason for his commander to take his gun away and tell him, you're not fit for action because of your behavior, why didn't he go the extra yard and also give me your gun and don't go with us to the next action, and also please step into the psychologist's office and have an interview with him to see what's happened.
Avshalom is another grieving father. In his Tel Aviv apartment, there are no photographs of his son Ran, who was in the army for only a few weeks before he took his life. His father says the signs were there, but too painful to acknowledge.
He was very, very tired. When he came back every day from the military, he fell on his bed and slept for 5-6 hours. Then at 6 o'clock in the morning, went back to the military. Only 3 months before, he was a healthy young boy with dreams and full of life. And all of a sudden, everything changed.
Someone who experienced traumatic event, traumatic scene, someone who were in a situation where his life were in a danger, he might be in a danger of commit suicide for sure. Within the army, they have access to the weapon.
The army says it's trying to end suicides through internal investigations and involving mental health professionals. But families say it's not enough. What is alarming about these stories is that the IDF is touted as one of the most efficient armies in the world, well equipped and strongly motivated. But the suicides among its ranks suggest that far from the battlefield outside, some recruits are fighting a battle of their own within. Pauluslia, RT, Tel Aviv.
Joining us in the now is Ronnie Barkin, conscientious objector and BDS activist, he calls himself. Ronnie, thanks for joining us. Why are we seeing a rise in IDF suicides, almost doubled last year, at least as you see it?
Hi, Anissa. I think that, first of all, we have to remember what happened only recently in Gaza, the recent attack, the recent massacre that took place in Gaza. People who attended it, the soldiers, the Israeli soldiers who took part, I believe that not all of them were totally indifferent to the crimes that were committed there. And I would assume that after they returned home and had time to reflect on what they did or what they experienced, that would explain some of these cases where people actually end their life in a very tragic.
You're not the first person to come on our show and make this correlation. Tell us, Ronnie, you were in the army at least for a little while, as far as I understand. What was your experience?
Well, I never took part in the Israeli army as a soldier. I was drafted because there is an obligatory military service in Israel. And like any other Israeli, I was brainwashed into thinking that my responsibility as a citizen of Israel is to serve in the army, and that I would be some sort of a parasite if I didn't. And the brainwashing mechanism, the indoctrination is very strong in Israel. So also myself, I got drafted into the army. 2 months into the army, I decided that I realized that I have a choice in the matter. And first and foremost, I'm a human being before being Israeli or anything else. And from that moment on, I decided that I cannot take part in the Israeli army any longer. So in my case, I was actually exempted from the Israeli army thanks to, by the hands of a mental health officer. It took me 1.5 years of speaking to many psychologists and psychiatrists in order to get out of there. And eventually I managed, but it took a very long time. The interesting thing to remember is that even though those people who are the mental health officers, they are in charge of the welfare of these soldiers in the Israeli army, the large number of suicides taking place are proving how much their capacity as mental health officers is limited or ineffective.
The IDF lost 2 soldiers just today on the Lebanese border. The argument is always going to be that there is a major security threat against Israel.
Well, the Israeli army, the Israel Defense Forces is only defense by name. It does very little in terms of defense. The incident today is maybe a different scenario. I have to look into it. I do not want to comment on something that I am not fully sure about. But if we look at what recently happened in Gaza, for example, it is very clear that the ones who are assaulting and massacring the other side are the Israelis who are, in that case, performing atrocious activities towards the Palestinians. And Israel is pretty much...
Ronnie, what about the aggression that we see from the Palestinian side?
There is, of course, there are Palestinian acts of terror, but they are negligible towards, in light of Israeli acts of terror. So the Israel Defense Forces, as it is called, is carrying out terror activity on a daily, hourly basis. It even incarcerates children as young as 12 and younger. It incarcerates political activists without due process. Who sit
Israel, and I'm just playing, of
jail.
course, devil's advocate here. Israel would say that this is because it has the right to protect itself, and these all fall into security measures.
We are trying to believe many myths and lies about Israel, including that claim that Israel acts in self-defense. What it did in Gaza, what it does in many other respects, has nothing to do with self-defense. It has a lot to do with control of a population that is subjugated under its control, and even benefiting from that situation. Israel has perfected its weaponry in Gaza, and they say it very clearly that they introduced premature drones and other weapons into the war scene, and now these weapons are mature and are marketable. And this is part of the motivation of what was happening and what is happening. The whole Israeli economy is based on profiting from the ongoing situation, profiting off occupation and profiting off the backs of Palestinians.
Ronnie Barkin, conscientious objector and BDS activist with us in the now from Brussels. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Well, the IDF is causing a stir on Twitter with the seemingly innocent hashtag of My Workplace. It's meant to encourage users to upload pictures like this. It backfired. The images plugged to the IDF hashtag My Workplace, here they are, and they're not pretty. More police gun abuse to report in the United States. 17-year-old Jessica Hernandez was shot and killed by a cop in Denver while driving an allegedly stolen car with her teenage friends. According to the police, they opened fire when the vehicle hit one of the officers. But witnesses say her body was then yanked out of the car and handcuffed. The deadly shooting sparked angry protests across the city. Another protest against North Miami Beach's police department is taking place online. It turns out its officers use these mugshots of black suspects for target practice. People are now posting their photos under the Use Me Instead hashtag on Twitter in response to this disgusting display. You've been in the Now. Thanks for watching. Check out our best clips on Facebook and YouTube and send your comments to @InTheNowRT. See you tomorrow. Till then, it's now or never.